Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to the endless grasslands of the 13th century. You can dim the lights, take a slow breath, and let the day fade away as we wander into a world ruled by wind, hooves, and people who slept closer to their horses than most of us sleep to our phones. Because tonight, we're not in the marble halls of Europe, or among powdered wigs and royal tantrums. No, tonight, we're out on the steppe, where the air is sharp, the sky is enormous, and everything, absolutely everything, depends on one animal, the Mongol horse. Tiny, scruffy, slightly judgmental-looking creatures, and yet, somehow, the reason half the medieval world woke up one day to find themselves conquered. Let's start with something soothingly factual. The Mongol horse was small, about the height of a modern pony. 4 feet, maybe 4.5, from hoof to shoulder. But what it lacked in glamour, it made up for in sheer stubborn endurance. Imagine a horse that could run all day on frozen grass, sleep standing up, and still have enough energy left to kick your helmet off. That was the Mongol horse. The Mongols didn't breed them for beauty. They bred them for survival, which, incidentally, was also how they treated their people. You didn't need to brush a Mongol horse, or feed it grain, or whisper affirmations into its ear. You mostly just needed to point it in a direction and try not to fall off. Now, unlike the delicate destriers of Europe, those great, muscle-bound status symbols that knights spent a fortune maintaining, Mongol horses were almost aggressively practical. Each warrior had several. 5, 10, sometimes more. Because, of course, when your empire stretches across half of Eurasia, you can't exactly stop for refuel. So, Mongol riders swapped mounts the way we swap playlists, every few hours, fresh legs, same direction. Each horse was lightly tacked with a simple saddle, short stirrups for balance, and a rein made from rawhide or horsehair. It was minimalist riding, less royal parade and more eternal field test. And they didn't name them either, by the way. Not the way we might. You wouldn't find Starshine or Daisy here. These were work animals, companions in conquest. Though, if you listen closely, some riders did have nicknames: the Good Bay, the Fast One, the Biter. You get the idea. The Mongols' relationship with their horses was intimate, to put it gently. They didn't just ride them, they lived off them. Horse milk was a staple, fermented into arag, a slightly alcoholic drink that probably tasted like sour yogurt in regret. When they were thirsty, they'd slit a vein in the horse's neck and drink the blood, just enough to keep both alive. Because who has time to stop for lunch when you're busy rewriting world geography? It's a surprisingly symbiotic relationship. The horses gave everything, and the Mongols gave, well, mostly orders. But it worked. Their horses could survive temperatures that killed European breeds, eat through blizzards, and even find buried grass under snow by pawing with their hooves. They didn't need stables, or shoes, or much affection. Honestly, they were the perfect companions for people who considered comfort a suspiciously foreign word. And speaking of foreign, when European knights finally came into contact with Mongol horsemen in the 13th century, they were unimpressed. They thought the horses looked ridiculous. Stubby, unimposing, not at all knightly. Which, of course, was part of the charm. Because while the knights were laughing, the Mongols were circling behind them at 30 miles an hour, knocking arrows backward at full gallop. The horses didn't need to be majestic, they just needed to not die. And on that front, they were world champions. Let's drift a little deeper into how these horses were bred and cared for. If you're picturing a royal stable with grooms, soft hay, and gentle lullabies, think again. Mongol horses lived year-round outdoors. Rain, snow, scorching sun, it didn't matter. There were no barns, just the open steppe, and perhaps a little shelter built from reeds in the harshest winters. And somehow, the population thrived. Maras were prized, since they produced both milk and foals, and stallions were carefully chosen for strength and stamina. But carefully in the Mongol sense, meaning, if it could outrun wolves and survive a sandstorm, congratulations, it's a breeder. They didn't use selective breeding charts or complex pedigrees. The herd itself was the pedigree. A living, breathing experiment in natural selection. Every horse was branded with a clan mark, a simple symbol scorched into the hide. Not out of cruelty, but practicality. Because when your herds number in the hundreds, you need to know which tiny brown horse belongs to which tiny brown warrior. Foals were born in spring, often in the open. If they survived, and not all did, they'd grow up in the same herds they'd one day carry into battle. They learned to follow the group, tolerate wind and noise, and run before they were even done wobbling. By the age of 2, they were already being ridden. By the age of 3, they were veterans. There's a kind of quiet poetry to that, isn't there? A life entirely devoted to motion, born running, living running, and often dying in motion. It's said Mongol riders could sleep in the saddle. And honestly, given the distances they traveled, who could blame them? They'd tie themselves to the horse with a rope around the waist, doze off, and let the animal follow the herd. That's trust. Or exhaustion. Probably both. The care rituals were simple but effective. When horses grew thin in winter, the Mongols cut open ice to let them drink. They'd melt snow in their hands for the weaker ones, and rub frost from their nostrils so they could breathe. They were rough people, but not unfeeling. After all, without their horses, they were nothing. And so the horse was more than transportation, it was identity. To be Mongol was to ride. If you couldn't ride, you might as well be a rock. And no one conquers the world on a rock. Let's talk about the saddles, because they tell you everything about the mindset. European saddles of the same period were big, heavy things, perfect for jousting, less ideal for traveling 200 miles in a day. Mongol saddles, by contrast, were small wooden frames covered in leather, with high pommels and candles for stability. They looked uncomfortable, and they were. But they let riders shoot arrows in any direction without falling off, which, in military terms, is what you might call useful. The stirrups were also crucial. They allowed the rider to stand, twist, and fire behind them, a signature move that terrified anyone unlucky enough to chase them. It's the same technique that let Mongol armies feign retreat, turn suddenly, and wipe out entire forces who thought they were winning. You could say the entire empire was built on the geometry of that saddle. The horses themselves came in every color: chestnut, bay, dun, gray. But there was something particularly beloved about the dun-colored ones, with that stripe down the back, the primitive pattern, as we call it now. They were seen as hardy, closer to nature. And in a way, they were the original wild horses of the steppe, barely tamed, barely domestic. A Mongol horse was not your friend. It was your partner. It didn't nuzzle you or prance. It tolerated you, like a colleague who's seen too much. And yet, the connection ran deep. In songs and poems, horses are praised for loyalty, bravery, and endurance. Even the great Khans were sometimes buried with their favorite mounts, a way of ensuring that, even in the afterlife, they could keep riding towards some eternal horizon. Now, if you're thinking all this sounds harsh, you're not wrong. But it's precisely that harshness that made Mongol cavalry unstoppable. Their horses needed no supply trains, no farriers, no fodder. They grazed wherever they went. And when there wasn't grass, they ate bark, snow, or whatever faint green thing they could find. If you could feed a European horse that way, you'd probably end up with a corpse. That's why Mongol armies could appear where no army should have been. Through deserts, mountains, frozen plains, they didn't just survive, they thrived. A force entirely self-sustaining, moving faster than messages could travel. It wasn't just logistics. It was evolution, turned into a war machine. Let's take a slower breath here. Because the more you think about it, the more remarkable it becomes. An entire empire, the largest contiguous one in history, built not on castles, or cities, or ships, but on horses. 1 million of them, give or take. And every one of them small, scrappy, and probably deeply unimpressed by everything. When Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes, he didn't do it with speeches or politics. He did it with mobility. He gave every warrior horses, every horseman a place in the grand herds. The empire expanded not because of any single battle, but because they could move faster, further, and with less. The horse was the bloodstream of the steppe. And the Mongols, well, they were its pulse. Let's end this first part where every Mongol day ended, with the sound of horses breathing in the night. Imagine it, the grass sighing in the wind, the stars sharp above, the campfires low. 1,000 riders asleep in their saddles or beside their mounts, wrapped in felt and dreams. The air smells of smoke, leather, and milk. The horses shift, snort softly, and the world keeps turning. They'll wake before dawn, mount up again, and vanish into the horizon like smoke. That's the rhythm of their lives, and, for a while, the rhythm of the world itself. Hey everyone. Welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. If not, well, that's perfectly fine too. This is history for the half asleep, after all. So, let's drift back again to the Mongol steppe. We've already met their small but surprisingly terrifying horses. Now it's time to see what those horses, and the people on top of them, actually did. Spoiler, they didn't stay home. The Mongols had what you might call an expansionist phase. It began with a man named Temüjin. You might know him better by his later title, Genghis Khan, which, roughly translated, means oceanic ruler. And, like the ocean, he had a habit of showing up everywhere you didn't expect him to. Temüjin was born around 1162, give or take. Historians aren't entirely sure, and neither, probably, was he. Life on the steppe didn't lend itself to paperwork. His early years were, shall we say, complicated. His father was poisoned by rival clans, his family was left destitute, and he spent part of his childhood eating roots and fishing by hand. Character building stuff. Or trauma, depending on how you look at it. By adulthood, he decided that no one was ever going to push him around again. And he had the charisma, the ruthlessness, and the organizational skills to make that stick. Now, what made Genghis Khan's empire building so strangely efficient wasn't just his leadership, though he was unsettlingly good at that. It was his understanding that horses, and the men who rode them, could function like a living organism. A moving network. Every soldier could cover vast distances, communicate instantly with signals or messengers, and fight at any angle, at any time. European armies of the same period were, let's say, less nimble. Knights preferred to announce themselves dramatically before charging. The Mongols preferred to appear out of nowhere, erase you, and leave before your messenger had finished lacing his boots. They used flags by day and torches by night for communication. The whole battlefield was like an early form of Bluetooth, if Bluetooth occasionally set your village on fire. Each unit was organized with the precision of an ant colony. Groups of 10 formed the base, commanded by one man. 10 of those made 100, 10 hundreds made 1,000, and 10,000 made a tumon. And at the top, the Khan himself, watching with calm, lethal patience. Every man had several horses, bows, armor made of leather and iron plates, and enough dried meat to last for weeks. They carried everything they needed, and needed very little. They could move faster than supply trains, faster than rumor. It's said that a Mongol army could cover 160 kilometers in a single day. For comparison, that's roughly the distance from Paris to Brussels. In one day. Without a paved road, without maps, without a sense of irony. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they adapted. When they entered China, they learned siege warfare from the engineers they captured. When they moved west, they borrowed technologies from Persians, Turks, and Russians. It wasn't cultural theft, exactly. It was more like forced collaboration. And everywhere they went, they left behind an eerie calm. Because once a city surrendered, the Mongols were surprisingly lenient. But if it resisted, well, let's just say it never resisted again. It's a moral system that can be summed up as peace or else. Let's drift now, a little slower, to the experience of one of those riders. Imagine it's dawn. The horizon is pale gold. You wake up wrapped in felt, breath visible in the cold. Your horse is already stirring, snorting clouds into the morning air. You eat a strip of dried meat, maybe a gulp of arag, the fermented mare's milk we mentioned earlier. Then you check your saddle, your bow, your arrows. Everything has its place. No excess, no luxury. You ride out with thousands of others. You don't talk much. Mongols weren't big on small talk in battle. The sound is mostly hooves and wind and leather creaking. You move together, like one living tide, each man aware of his place, his duty, and the rhythm of the herd. By noon, you might already be halfway to a town no one in Europe has ever heard of, but soon will. And here's the strange thing, for a civilization often described as barbaric, the Mongols were astonishingly organized. Their postal system, called the Yam, stretched across continents. Relay stations every few dozen miles, stocked with food, spare horses, and guards. It was like a 13th century version of FedEx, except your parcel might also be a royal decree or a severed head. Messengers carried little bronze passports engraved with the Khan's seal. That seal meant instant obedience. No one questioned it. Which, admittedly, is a very efficient form of customer service. Thanks to this system, information could travel from Mongolia to the Caspian Sea in a few days, faster than many modern postal services, if we're being honest. Now, you might wonder, what kept this vast machine from falling apart? After all, most empires do. The answer, oddly enough, was discipline. Not the kind that involves standing at attention in shiny boots, but the kind that involved, well, consequences. If one man deserted, his entire group of 10 might be executed. If a unit failed to fight bravely, the commander was punished along with his men. Brutal, yes, but remarkably effective. It wasn't loyalty to the Khan that kept them together. It was loyalty to each other. And a shared understanding that running away was not, in the long term, good for your health. There's a quiet irony in how this nomadic empire, built on speed, motion, and impermanence, ended up creating one of the most stable trade systems the world had ever seen. The Pax Mongolica, they called it. The Mongol Peace. From China to Europe, trade flourished. Silk, spices, glass, gunpowder all flowed along the reopened Silk Roads. You could, for the first time, travel from Venice to Beijing without being robbed more than once. And for the merchants who survived, that was considered excellent odds. Even Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler, owed his fame to this Mongol order. Though, to be fair, Marco Polo owed quite a lot to embellishment, too. But that's another bedtime story. Genghis himself wasn't the kind of ruler you'd want to invite to dinner. But he was curious. He respected talent. If you were clever, he didn't care where you came from. He employed Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, even Muslim astronomers. For a man often depicted as a whirlwind of destruction, he was strangely pragmatic. He outlawed kidnapping women, a nice gesture, though he himself had, shall we say, a flexible understanding of marriage. He promoted people by merit rather than birth. He enforced religious tolerance. And he introduced a law code called the Yasa, a sort of steppe constitution, enforced by, well, absolute fear. It's a bit like saying, everyone is equal, or equally doomed if they cross me. Let's pause for a softer image. At night, the Mongol camps were surprisingly peaceful. The tents, jairs, or yurts, arranged neatly, fires burning low, guards stationed in perfect silence. Somewhere, a horse nickers softly. Children play with bone toys, women milk maras under the stars. In the distance, a drum beat, marking the hours. There's order in the chaos, simplicity in the movement, and a sense that everything, every life, every saddle, every hoofbeat, belongs to the same rhythm. It's the kind of scene that makes you understand how they endured. Not through cruelty alone, but through balance. Through knowing exactly what mattered. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire already stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian. And his successors, his sons and grandsons, kept expanding. Ogedei took the throne, then Monk, and the infamous Kublai Khan eventually ruled China itself. At one point, the Mongols controlled more land than any other empire in history, about a fifth of the world's surface. All because a few horsemen refused to stay put. But empires built on motion don't age well. Once the horses stopped, things got complicated. The grandsons of Genghis started arguing, as grandsons tend to do. One took Persia, another took Russia, another took China. The unity dissolved into fragments, khanates, each more dysfunctional than the last. Still, for about a century, the world had been Mongol-shaped. And that's quite a run for a people whose main domestic product was fermented milk. Let's end this part where the empire began, with a lone rider, crossing the grasslands. He's small against the sky, his horse steady beneath him. The air hums with that low, endless wind. Behind him lies a continent, conquered, connected, changed forever. Ahead, only more horizon. He doesn't look back. Because no Mongol ever really did. Hey everyone. Welcome back. If you've somehow made it through the Mongol invasions without dozing off, impressive. But now, let's take things a little slower. We're leaving the galloping chaos of conquest behind, and drifting into something more peculiar. Tonight, we're visiting the court of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, emperor of China, ruler of everything east of reason. A man who tried, quite sincerely, to blend the spirit of the nomad with the luxury of an imperial palace. Imagine a warrior born in a tent, trying to live like a god in a golden hall. That's Kublai. And as you might expect, it didn't always go smoothly. Kublai Khan was born in 1215, the same year the English were busy signing the Magna Carta, which is an adorable coincidence, since Kublai would have had no idea what limited monarchy meant. He grew up surrounded by stories of his grandfather's victories, those vast, wind-blown legends of Genghis Khan's unstoppable armies. But Kublai's world was already changing. The steppe was still there, yes, but the Mongols were no longer just herders and raiders. They were rulers of cities, kingdoms, tax systems, and complicated people who didn't think in horse herds. Kublai, to his credit, tried to understand it all. He studied Chinese philosophy, read Confucian texts, and surrounded himself with scholars who, frankly, had seen more books than he had blades of grass. He listened. He learned. And then, naturally, he declared himself Emperor of China. Because self-awareness has never been an occupational hazard of conquerors. When he took power, he moved the Mongol capital from the steppe to a new city, Kanbalik, which you might know today as Beijing. It was, in many ways, a declaration of intent. The Mongols weren't just passing through anymore. They were here to stay. He built palaces, vast, echoing spaces with marble floors and golden roofs. He ordered canals, postal systems, granaries, astronomical observatories. For a man descended from horse herders, Kublai was remarkably domestic. And yet, he never really lost the steppe. His court might have been filled with silk and scholars, but his heart belonged to open skies. He'd often retreat to his hunting grounds, where he could surround himself with horses, falcons, and the sound of wind, reminders that, beneath the silk, he was still a son of the grasslands. Kublai was, in many ways, a contradiction in human form. He was generous and curious, but also ruthless. He supported science and art, but executed anyone who challenged him. He invited foreign envoys, including a certain Venetian named Marco Polo, and listened politely as they flattered him. Marco Polo described him in glowing terms: wise, noble, majestic. But let's be honest, if the man feeding you dumplings could also have you dismembered, you'd probably say nice things too. Still, Polo's stories gave Europe its first real glimpse of the East. Silk, paper money, porcelain, spices, fireworks, all these exotic marvels that sounded, to medieval ears, like pure fantasy. And in fairness, the Yuan court really did look like something out of a dream. Picture this. Golden halls, enormous red banners, musicians playing strange flutes and bells. Nobles in embroidered robes. Servants carrying trays of steaming dumplings and silver cups of kumis, fermented mare's milk again, because old habits die hard. Outside, the great city hums, traders, monks, horses, merchants. The Silk Road, reborn, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. It was a world where a Venetian could end up in Mongolia, and a Persian could run a Chinese tax office. Globalization, 13th century edition. Now, let's talk about one of Kublai's more ambitious and catastrophic hobbies: naval warfare. Because, of course, every steppe empire eventually looks at the ocean and thinks, why not? Kublai had conquered almost everything that could be reached on horseback. And then, someone told him about Japan. A few small islands. Rich, beautiful, nearby. How hard could it be? Very, as it turns out. In 1274, he launched his first invasion. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, Mongols, Koreans, and Chinese, all crammed together. They landed, fought, and, for a brief moment, nearly won. But then, a storm rolled in. A really big one. The fleet was wrecked, men drowned, and the survivors limped home to explain the problem. Most rulers would have taken the hint. Kublai didn't. He spent the next 7 years building an even bigger fleet. New ships, better armor, improved tactics, everything except, apparently, a working understanding of meteorology. In 1281, he tried again. It was one of the largest amphibious invasions in history, until the weather struck again. Another storm. Another disaster. The Japanese called it kamikaze, the divine wind. For Kublai, it was just Tuesday. 2 failed invasions later, he finally gave up. You could almost hear the horses back in Mongolia sighing in relief. They'd always said boats were a bad idea. Still, failure didn't sink Kublai's empire immediately. It was too vast, too well organized. He introduced paper currency, a novelty that confused most people but eventually worked. He expanded the Grand Canal, linking the grain-rich south to the hungry north. He built schools, hospitals, and infrastructure on a scale unseen in Asia before him. He also ate spectacularly well. Banquets at his court featured hundreds of dishes, roast mutton, duck, exotic fruits, and endless streams of wine and kumis. He grew obese, reportedly needing help to stand in his later years. The steppe warrior had become the sedentary emperor. The hunter had turned into the hunted, by gout. And there's something oddly human in that, isn't there? The idea that even the most unstoppable conqueror eventually meets his match in his own reflection. But Kublai's empire had cracks. Deep ones. The Mongol elite still saw themselves as conquerors, not administrators. The Chinese subjects viewed them as foreigners. And while Kublai tried to bridge that gap with tolerance and reform, resentment quietly grew underneath the silken ceremony. His armies, once unstoppable, were now expensive, tired, and occasionally drunk. His court filled with intrigue, flattery, and corruption, all those comforting signs of an empire getting ready for its long nap. When Kublai died in 1294, the Yuan dynasty still stood, glittering, impressive, and slightly unstable. Within less than a century, it would collapse, replaced by the native Ming dynasty. The Mongols retreated north, back to the steppe, back to the grass and the wind, as if history itself were gently resetting them. Still, Kublai's reign left a strange, enduring legacy. He had turned the Mongol machine into something more than a storm. For a brief moment, it became a bridge between East and West, old and new, horse and empire. The Silk Road flourished under his rule. Caravans carried not just silk and spices, but ideas, mathematics, astronomy, medicine. Arabic numerals crept into Europe. Gunpowder followed. So did stories, like Marco Polo's, that fired imaginations for centuries. All from an empire born on horseback, carried forward by a man who never quite learned when to stop. Let's take a quiet moment here, as the lights of Kublai's city flicker in the distance. You can almost hear it, the sound of music drifting through palace halls, the muffled clatter of cups, the laughter of courtiers who know better than to laugh too loudly. Somewhere outside the walls, a rider looks up at the stars and remembers a simpler life, the smell of steppe grass, the rhythm of hooves, the clean silence of open land. Empires rise, shine, and fall. But the grass remains. The horses graze. And the wind keeps moving. That, perhaps, is the quiet truth the Mongols always understood. You can build cities of gold or conquer half the world, but in the end, everything returns to the horizon. Hey everyone. Welcome back again. If you've drifted off and just woken up, don't worry. You haven't missed much. Just an empire quietly falling apart in slow motion. Tonight, we're floating through the twilight years of the Mongol world, the time when the greatest riders on Earth realized they'd finally ridden too far. Because even the strongest winds eventually die down. And when the Mongols stopped moving, they stopped being Mongols. When Kublai Khan died in 1294, the empire was still technically whole. A vast, shimmering patchwork stretching from the Black Sea to the Pacific. But beneath the maps and the titles, the seams were already splitting. His successors were nowhere near his equal. They lacked his vision, his diplomacy, and, crucially, his ability to tell when a war wasn't worth it. Each branch of the Mongol family, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, began acting like a teenager who just discovered independence. All technically related, all pretending they got along, and all secretly planning each other's downfall. The Mongol Empire, once a single roaring current, had become a collection of puddles. And like all puddles, they began evaporating. Let's start with the West, the Golden Horde. They ruled over what we now think of as Russia and parts of Eastern Europe. At first, they did quite well. They collected tribute, terrorized the occasional prince, and kept their horses well fed. But over time, the locals began adapting. The Russians learned to play the tribute game, offering gold and flattery until the Khans fought among themselves. And eventually, the Khans did exactly that, because, of course, they did. By the 15th century, the once mighty Golden Horde had splintered into smaller states, their Khans squabbling like cats over a dwindling food bowl. And then, From the forests of Moscow rose a new power, one that would quietly replace them. The Mongols had once ridden into Russia from the east. Now, Russia would ride back into history from the west. Meanwhile, down south, the Ilkhanate in Persia was having its own identity crisis. They'd started off strong, rebuilding cities, sponsoring art, even flirting with religious tolerance. But then came the usual medieval problems: plague, bad harvests, and leaders who believed astrology was a substitute for strategy. By the mid-1300s, the Ilkhanate collapsed entirely. Local dynasties took over, and the Mongol bloodline faded into Persian aristocracy, diluted, decorative, and mostly forgotten. A fitting end for an empire that once tried to tax the desert. Back in Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate managed to hold on a little longer, mostly by doing what Central Asia has always done best: trading, arguing, and occasionally invading its neighbors. But even there, Mongol rule became less about conquest and more about paperwork. The once proud horsemen had turned into bureaucrats. There were ledgers where there used to be lances. And no one ever wrote an epic poem about successful tax audits. And then, of course, there was China, the jewel of Kublai's empire. Under the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols had ruled for nearly a century. But the longer they stayed, the less Mongol they became. Their horses grew soft in the stables. Their riders wore silk instead of armor. Their nobles began preferring tea to kumis, and poetry to pillaging, which, while admirable, was not exactly sustainable when ruling millions of people who hated you. Corruption seeped into everything. Officials sold offices, generals faked reports, and taxes vanished into the pockets of men who hadn't seen the steppe in decades. Famines broke out. Peasants revolted. And when the Yellow River flooded, as it often did, it was taken as a sign that heaven itself had revoked its mandate. By the 1350s, rebel bands were forming across China. They called themselves things like the Red Turbans and the White Lotus. Colorful names, messy results. After years of chaos, one of their leaders, Yuan, finally marched on Beijing. In 1368, the Mongols were driven out. And just like that, the Yuan dynasty was gone, replaced by the Ming. Kublai's heirs fled north, back toward Mongolia, taking what they could carry: gold, relics, and their lingering sense of superiority. So, what went wrong? How did the people who conquered half the planet lose it so quietly? Part of it, honestly, was math. You can't run an empire of 100 million people using the logistics of a horse herd. You can conquer cities on horseback, yes. You just can't govern them that way. The Mongols were excellent at movement, less excellent at management. They could destroy with elegance, but administration was not their strongest subject. They also struggled with identity. Were they nomads or emperors? Conquerors or rulers? Every generation leaned one way or the other, never quite finding balance. It's hard to preserve the fierce simplicity of the steppe when you're busy debating court etiquette. And then there was the plague, the Black Death, which spread along the same trade routes the Mongols had worked so hard to protect. The irony, of course, is exquisite. The very roads that brought wealth to the empire also brought the disease that weakened it. You could almost hear the universe quietly chuckling. But for all their decline, the Mongols didn't vanish completely. Their influence lingered, in maps, in trade, in culture. They'd redrawn the world's borders, connected continents, and shifted the axis of history. Even centuries later, echoes of their empire remained. Russian autocrats learned the art of absolute rule from their Mongol overlords. Chinese dynasties inherited their postal and administrative systems. Europe, through the Silk Road, discovered new goods, ideas, and diseases, a very mixed gift basket, but still appreciated. And far beyond the physical empire, the Mongols left behind a legend, one part terror, one part fascination. the unstoppable riders from the east, who seem to appear out of thin air, conquer the world, and then quietly dissolve into it. It's a narrative that still feels oddly soothing, perhaps because it reminds us that even the most powerful things are temporary. Let's drift, for a moment, to the steppe again, centuries later, long after the empire is gone. The grass still ripples in the wind. The same wind that once carried the hooves of 1,000 armies. There are no banners now, no camps, no thunder of war. Just shepherds, quietly tending their flocks under the same endless sky. If you listen carefully, maybe you can almost hear the ghosts of hooves, a faint rhythm, fading into the earth. The empire is gone, but the steppe endures. And in a way, that's the most fitting legacy. Because for all their ambitions, their cities, their titles, their wars, the Mongols always belonged to the land. To motion. To impermanence. They rose like a storm and vanished like mist. And if you close your eyes, it's easy to imagine that's exactly how they'd have wanted it. Still, not everyone let the legacy go. Every so often, a ruler in Central Asia would claim descent from Genghis Khan, a handy bit of branding, really. It lent a certain credibility, especially if you were about to invade someone. Even Timur, or Tamerlane, as he's often called, made sure to marry into the Genghis line, just to borrow a little reflected glory. Timur's empire would, of course, fall apart too. Because that's what empires do. They're like bonfires on the steppe, bright, hot, and brief. No matter how much fuel you throw in, the wind always wins in the end. Let's linger a little longer, here at the quiet end of the story. The Mongol Empire began with a man and a horse, nothing more. And it ended much the same way. No grand collapse, no final battle, just fading. Somewhere, a last descendant of the Khans rides through the grasslands, wrapped in furs, watching the horizon. He carries no empire now, just memories. The sky stretches endless and cold. The air smells of rain and smoke. He hums an old song his ancestors once sang before battle. It drifts into the wind and disappears. And that's how it goes. History, in the end, always circles back to silence. So, as you rest tonight, remember, the world we live in still carries the traces of those hoofbeats. Every border, every road, every exchange of ideas owes something, somewhere, to a small, stubborn horse and the people who refuse to stay still. And maybe that's the lesson, that motion, not monument, is what endures. The Mongols never built great temples or statues. They built connections, invisible ones. The kind that echo through time, quietly, like distant thunder. Hey everyone. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially outlasted the Mongol Empire. And if you've dozed off and just opened your eyes again, welcome back. You've missed roughly 200 years of political chaos, give or take a few assassinations. Tonight, we're gliding gently through the afterlife of the Mongols, not the empire itself, but the lingering shadows it cast. The forgotten princes, the displaced bloodlines, the faint traces of steppe dust that settled over Europe and Asia for centuries. Because even when the empire disappeared, its descendants didn't. They just learned how to fade quietly into noble courts, merchant dynasties, and occasionally, absolute obscurity. Let's start with the thing that never really went away, the idea of Genghis Khan. The man himself was long dead, buried in a secret grave that no one ever found, though plenty of people have tried. Legends say his burial site was hidden deliberately. His soldiers rode horses over the ground to erase all signs of the tomb, and then they killed the diggers, and then they killed the killers. You know, as one does, when one really values privacy. But even without a body, Genghis lived on. He became myth. A name that terrified kings and inspired emperors. Long after his actual empire was gone, rulers still claimed to be descended from him, some truthfully, some creatively. In parts of Central Asia, Genghisid blood was treated almost like a holy relic. You could be completely useless as a leader, weak, indecisive, maybe mildly allergic to horses, but if you could trace your lineage to the Great Khan, people still bowed when you entered the room. It was dynastic nepotism at its finest. The Golden Horde in Russia, even after splintering, clung to this legacy. Its later Khans still styled themselves as heirs of the steppe. But by the 15th century, their descendants were quietly merging into local aristocracies. Some converted to Islam. Some became Russian vassals. And others simply disappeared into history. Their children married into princely families, their banners faded, and before long, descendant of the Great Khan was something you mentioned over dinner, right before realizing no one believed you anymore. One curious little historical footnote. Many of the noble families in Central Asia and parts of Russia today still claim descent from Genghis Khan. If you add up all those claims, statistically speaking, Genghis may now have more descendants than an entire small country. Which, given his track record for mobility and vigor, is not entirely surprising. Meanwhile, in Persia, the old Ilkhanate lands, the Mongol legacy took a different turn. The Khans there had embraced Persian culture so completely that, within a few generations, they stopped being recognizably Mongol at all. Their descendants became Persian nobles, patrons of poets and scholars. They built observatories instead of siege engines. They funded calligraphers instead of cavalry. And eventually, they became just another part of the region's long, tangled aristocracy, their Mongol blood quietly absorbed into the silk and perfume of Persian high society. It's a little ironic, really. The people who once saw themselves as conquerors of the world ended up debating architecture and theology over tea. But then again, it's hard to stay a barbarian when your carpets are that nice. Over in China, things were different still. After the fall of the Yuan dynasty, the Ming emperors worked hard to erase the Mongols from the national memory. They tore down palaces, rewrote records, and made sure that any surviving Mongol elites were either exiled, assimilated, or politely exterminated. But ideas are harder to kill than people. And the Mongols had left plenty behind, from administrative systems to postal routes to architectural influences. Even the Great Wall as we think of it today, that iconic, snaking stone barrier, owes much of its final form to the Ming's desire to keep the Mongols out. You could say the Mongols built the wall, indirectly, through sheer annoyance. Ironically, some of the Mongols who were pushed out of China simply returned to the steppe and rebuilt small khanates of their own, miniature echoes of the empire, trying to rekindle the old flame. But the world had moved on. Gunpowder and bureaucracy had replaced horsemen and thunder. The steppe no longer dictated the fate of empires. Still, not all was lost. Even centuries later, the descendants of the Khans continued to matter, if not politically, then at least symbolically. Let's drift for a moment to the 14th century, to a man named Timur, or Tamerlane, as the Europeans called him. Timur was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, a fact that annoyed him greatly. So, being a practical man, he decided to solve that problem the medieval way, by marrying into the family. He took a wife who was descended from Genghis's line, then adopted the title Gurgen, meaning son-in-law of the Great Khan. That way, he could still claim a whiff of that sacred legitimacy while rebuilding his own empire out of the ashes of the old. Timur's empire stretched across Central Asia and into Persia, and for a brief, brutal moment, it almost looked like the Mongols were back. But Timur's rule was more about architecture and spectacle than administration. He built glittering cities like Samarkand, filled with domes, gardens, and towers, monuments to his ego and his taste for turquoise tiles. And then, predictably, after his death, his empire fell apart too. Because, again, it's difficult to build a lasting government when your main management strategy involves burning everything to the ground. Timur's descendants, the Timurids, lasted a little longer. They became patrons of art, mathematics, and astronomy. One of Timur's great-great-grandsons, Ulugh Beg, was more interested in stars than in war. He built an enormous observatory in Samarkand, one of the finest in the world at the time, and spent his nights mapping the heavens. It's a strangely poetic twist. The Mongol legacy, born in blood and thunder, eventually turned into a quiet devotion to the sky. But the most famous heir of the Mongol and Timurid bloodlines was yet to come. You probably know him, though perhaps not as a Mongol. His name was Babur, the founder of the Mongol Empire in India. Babur was descended from both Timur and Genghis Khan, a sort of dynastic double whammy. By his own account, he was proud of that heritage, though he had mixed feelings about it, describing himself as a poor man descended from great ancestors. It's the kind of line you could imagine written in a royal diary somewhere between existential dread and really good poetry. In 1526, Babur invaded India and founded the Mughal dynasty, a name derived from Mongol. And for the next 3 centuries, his descendants would rule over one of the richest empires the world had ever seen. So yes, the Mongols fell, but they didn't vanish. They just changed climates. They traded the cold winds of the steppe for the monsoon heat of India. They swapped yurts for marble palaces. And instead of horse milk, they developed a taste for mangoes and rose water. The Mughals would, of course, leave their own extraordinary legacy, the Taj Mahal, the peacock throne, the vast syncretic culture of northern India. But under all that splendor lay the faint, persistent hum of their Mongol ancestry, the same drive to expand, to command, to shape the world in their image. In a way, Babur and his descendants were the final echo of the Mongol storm, softer now, gilded with Persian refinement and Indian beauty, but still carrying the same restless DNA. By the 18th century, though, that echo too began to fade. The Mongol identity, once so fierce and singular, had dissolved entirely into the mix of world empires. Russia absorbed the last of the steppe khanates. China grew confident again. The Mongols declined. And the great horse nations of Eurasia, from Hungary to Mongolia, became spectators in a world now driven by ships and gunpowder, not cavalry. But the Mongols had already done their work. They'd changed the shape of everything. Trade routes, languages, populations, all had been shuffled, blended, and rewired by that century of conquest. The Silk Road was never the same. Europe's awareness of Asia expanded. And perhaps most strangely of all, modern globalization, the idea that the world is interconnected, can trace some of its earliest roots to the Mongols' empire of roads, couriers, and cross-cultural exchange. It's a funny thought, really. That a people once defined by motion, by horses, by herds, by endless wandering, might have been the first to connect the entire world. As for Mongolia itself, it eventually slipped into quiet obscurity. Its wide plains remained, unchanged and eternal. But its people, the heirs of the horse lords, became nomads once more. Herders, hunters, wanderers. Still singing the old songs of the steppe. Every few centuries, someone would try to resurrect the spirit of Genghis Khan, usually unsuccessfully. But the memory endured. It waited. And in the 20th century, long after the last empire had fallen, that memory came roaring back. The Mongols, newly independent, reclaimed their past, not as conquerors, but as a people bound by the same wind, the same grass, and the same sky. They built monuments to Genghis again. Statues gleamed under the sunrise. And for the first time in 700 years, the name of the great Khan was spoken openly, not as legend, but as national pride. And that brings us, softly, to the end of our drift. From the birth of an empire in the whispering steppe winds, to its final echo in the marble halls of India, to the quiet rebirth of a people under the same endless sky. The Mongols began as herders. They became emperors. And finally, they became myth. And maybe that's how history always works. Civilizations rise, fall, and fade, but their stories linger. And in the quiet moments, late at night, when the world is still, you can almost hear them again. The horses, the wind, the laughter of warriors by the fire, and the faint sound of hooves on the horizon, moving ever onward, never staying still. So as you close your eyes tonight, remember this. Even the greatest storm becomes a breeze. Even empires, like dreams, dissolve in time. But somewhere out there, under the stars, the steppe still breathes. And the spirit of the Mongols, restless, untamed, eternal, still rides. Sleep well. And may your dreams gallop gently. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're leaving behind the winds of the steppe and drifting further west, to a land of marble hills, olive trees, and a young prince who thought the world was a puzzle meant to be solved with a sword. Welcome to Macedon, somewhere between Greece and ambition. A kingdom that was half civilized, half feral, and fully determined to make history notice it. This is the story of the royal pages and the hetairoi, the privileged boys and men who surrounded Macedon's kings, grew up alongside Alexander the Great, and occasionally helped him conquer most of the known world. Or, depending on the day, almost got executed by him. Because, as we'll see tonight, nothing says ancient leadership training quite like mixing military glory with casual paranoia. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. And let's drift back to the court of Philip II, where every young noble dreamed of being close to power. And no one realized how dangerous that dream could be. Macedon, in the 4th century BCE, was a place of contradictions. It looked Greek on the surface, temples, poets, philosophy. But beneath the veneer, it was rougher, wilder, less symposium, more spearpoint. Its kings liked to drink hard, fight harder, and then rebuild whatever got set on fire the night before. The nobles, the hetairoi, or companions, were bound to their king through loyalty, flattery, and, ideally, several generations of intermarriage. If Philip II was the father of Macedon, then the hetairoi were his slightly overconfident sons. They were elite cavalrymen, men of land and lineage, and their job was simple: charge first, think later, and make sure everyone remembered who led the charge. They formed the sharp, glittering edge of Macedon's army, thundering into battle on massive horses that cost more than most villages. When they rode together, they were unstoppable. When they argued, which was often, things tended to end in duels, exiles, or regrettable banquets. But beneath this world of grown men and gold, there was another circle, smaller, younger, and in many ways more fascinating. The royal pages, or basilikoi paids. Imagine them as the king's hand-picked hostages and protégés, noble sons from across Macedon, brought to court to serve, learn, and, occasionally, survive. It was an honor, of course. The kind that could get you killed. Each boy, usually around 13 or 14, was chosen from one of Macedon's powerful families. They served as attendants to the king, holding his horse, guarding his tent, bringing him his armor, and pretending not to notice when the royal drinking parties got wildly out of hand. But their real purpose was less glamorous. They were hostages in all but name. Their presence at court ensured their father's loyalty. If a noble got rebellious, the king had leverage, in the shape of his teenage son polishing the royal shield. It was, in short, a brilliant system of control disguised as mentorship. Still, it wasn't all manipulation and menace. The pages received an education that would make a modern prep school look like amateur hour. They were trained in music, rhetoric, hunting, military drill, and the delicate art of flattering a man with a crown. and among them, a few would rise to greatness, most famously, a young prince named Alexander. He arrived at court around the age of 12, bright-eyed and already convinced he was destined for more than just ruling Macedon. His father, Philip II, encouraged this, partly out of pride, and partly because it amused him to see just how arrogant a child could get with Aristotle as his tutor. Yes, that Aristotle. The philosopher himself was hired to educate Alexander and the other royal youths, turning a band of restless teenage boys into philosophers, generals, and the occasional tragic footnote. The royal pages adored Alexander, and in return, he inspired them with the kind of obsessive loyalty only teenage camaraderie can produce. They hunted together, trained together, fought mock battles in the courtyard, and shared endless nights of talk about glory, destiny, and the strange, glowing future that seemed to wait for them. It must have been intoxicating, this sense of being chosen. They weren't just students, they were the seeds of an empire. And yet, even in this golden circle, danger simmered. Because proximity to power, in Macedon, was always a little radioactive. One mistake, one insult, one drunken joke overheard by the wrong general, and a promising young page could end up retired to the afterlife. Philip II himself, for all his brilliance, was not a man who encouraged open debate. He was a one-eyed conqueror with a temper and a taste for theater, a king who turned paranoia into an art form. He transformed Macedon from a backwater into a military powerhouse, but he trusted almost no one. His hetairoi were his friends, his drinking companions, and occasionally his victims. It was said that to dine with Philip was to risk death, not from poison, but from saying something that might sound like criticism. Still, he inspired fierce devotion. The hetairoi would follow him anywhere, through mountain passes, across the Aegean, even into Greece itself, which they conquered with admirable efficiency and almost no remorse. When Alexander came of age, he inherited both the hetairoi and the pages, and with them, all of Macedon's glory and dysfunction. He was their prince, their commander, their friend, and sometimes, their executioner. The hetairoi became the core of his cavalry, the elite shock troops who would charge alongside him through Persia, India, and myth itself. Names like Hephaestion, Clitus, and Parmenion would become famous, sometimes for bravery, sometimes for betrayal, often for both. And the royal pages followed too, serving as his aides-de-camp and messengers. They saw more of the world before age 20 than most men did in a lifetime. They crossed deserts, scaled mountains, and marched through lands so strange they might as well have been dreams. Some of them died heroes. Some died quietly, far from home. And a few, in darker moments, found themselves accused of treason, victims of Alexander's growing suspicion that everyone was secretly plotting against him. Because if Macedon taught one thing, it was this: the closer you stood to the king, the colder it got. The story of the royal pages ends, as so many Macedonian stories do, in blood. In 327 BCE, during Alexander's long and increasingly tense campaign in Bactria, a group of pages was accused of conspiring to assassinate him. The alleged leader, Hermolaus, had once been a favorite, quick, brave, and outspoken. But one day, he disobeyed a command during a hunt, and Alexander publicly punished him. Humiliated, Hermolaus and a few companions plotted revenge. They were discovered, of course. Alexander's empire, by then, ran on equal parts loyalty and fear. The boys were tried, or something resembling a trial, and executed. It's hard not to feel the tragedy in that moment. Young men who had grown up idolizing their king, dying for the crime of disappointment. It was the Macedonian way, intense love, followed by equally intense destruction. And what of the hetairoi? They would carry Alexander's ambitions to their breaking point. They charged through Persia, toppled Darius, founded cities with names like Alexandria, because modesty was not Alexander's strong suit, and reached India itself. But by then, the Hetairoi were exhausted, in body, in spirit, and in patience. They had followed their king to the edge of the world, and all they wanted was to go home. Alexander refused. They mutinied. He forgave them, mostly, and then drank himself toward legend. When he died in Babylon, the Hetairoi wept, tore their clothes, and immediately began plotting against each other. The empire they'd helped build fractured almost overnight. But their legend remained, the shining image of a cavalry charge at dawn, the thunder of hooves on Persian dust, and a young king racing ahead of his own destiny. The royal pages, the Hetairoi, the Macedonian court, they were all parts of a single system. A system that raised boys into soldiers, soldiers into conquerors, and conquerors into myths. And like all myths, it burned brightly and briefly. When the last of Alexander's generals died, the world moved on. Macedon became history. The pages became a footnote. The Hetairoi became a romantic memory, symbols of courage, loyalty, and the faint, tragic beauty of those who live too close to greatness. So, if you ever look at an old mosaic or a piece of Greek pottery and see a line of riders charging across it, helmets gleaming, horses mid-gallop, think of them. The boys who served kings. The men who followed them into eternity. They were the companions of Macedon, fierce, loyal, flawed, and forgotten. They believed they were shaping history, and in a way, they were. But history, as always, shaped them right back. The steppe had its riders. Macedon had its companions. Different lands, different kings, but the same old story. Power, loyalty, ambition, and the quiet price of standing too close to the sun. Sleep well, everyone. And remember, the world may forget names, but it never forgets the sound of hooves. Hey everyone. Tonight, we drift toward the end of a legend, a slow, flickering fade rather than a grand finale. Alexander the Great has conquered the world, or at least, the parts of it his maps allowed him to imagine. He's crossed mountains that broke lesser armies, stormed cities that were said to be untakeable, and turned his own name into a synonym for glory. But even the brightest fires leave ashes behind. And in the summer of 323 BCE, the most powerful man on earth began to fall apart, quietly, almost politely, as if even death hesitated to interrupt him. This is the story of his final days. And the chaos that followed once the gods, as it were, stopped returning his calls. So, settle in. Dim the lights. And let's drift through the silence after the shouting, the strange twilight between empire and memory. By the time Alexander reached Babylon, he was 32 years old and ancient in everything but years. He had marched across half the known world, fought more battles than birthdays, and buried too many friends along the way. His hair, once the color of bronze, had started to fade. His armor no longer gleamed. He had begun to drink too much, as though the wine might dissolve the weight of the crown. And perhaps most tellingly, his laughter, once bright and reckless, had grown rare. The man who'd charged through Persia like a thunderstorm now sat in marble halls, listening to flatterers recite his supposed divinity. Some called him the son of Zeus. Others, a living god. Alexander himself, depending on the hour, half believed it. But the body is unimpressed by myth. And his was failing. It began, according to most accounts, with a fever. A small one at first. A little warmth, a little fatigue, the kind of thing any campaigner might shrug off. Then the sweating. Then the pain. Then, the slow realization that something inside him had shifted, quietly and fatally. Ancient sources disagree on what exactly killed him. Malaria. Typhoid. A burst blood vessel. Poison, though, frankly, he'd have had to survive for weeks to make that theory plausible. Whatever it was, it came on steadily. He couldn't stand. He couldn't eat. His voice weakened. But his mind stayed sharp, cruelly sharp. He called for his officers, one by one. He asked for his horse, Bucephalus, long dead by then, though in his feverish mind perhaps still waiting outside the tent. He gave vague instructions for future campaigns, Arabia, Africa, who knows, plans that died as he spoke them. And then he did what kings do when they've run out of orders. He lay back and waited for the silence. It's said that his soldiers, thousands of them, lined up outside his chamber for days, filing past in tears to see him one last time. They touched his hand. They begged him to speak. He nodded, faintly, though by then it's unclear whether he knew they were there. Some claimed he raised his hand in farewell. Others said he smiled. The stories vary, which is how you know he was important. He died soon after, sometime in early June, 323 BCE. In Babylon. In a palace that wasn't his, in a land that would never truly belong to him. And that was that. The god was gone. The world, predictably, panicked. There was no heir. Alexander's only legitimate child was not yet born. His half-brother, Aridaeus, was mentally unfit, simple, as the sources delicately put it, though that word probably hides a host of tragedies. The army, the generals, the administrators, all stood staring at one another, waiting for someone to speak first. The silence stretched. And then, naturally, they began to shout. It's difficult to overstate just how badly things unraveled in the years after Alexander's death. His empire had been held together not by bureaucracy or ideology, but by his personal gravity. When that vanished, the pieces drifted apart, like stars collapsing back into dust. The first cracks appeared in Babylon itself. His generals, the Diadochi, or successors, began arguing over who should rule. Each claimed loyalty to Alexander's legacy. Each, of course, meant his own. Ptolemy took Egypt. Antigonus took Asia Minor. Seleucus eventually carved out Persia. And a dozen others grabbed whatever corner of the world their armies could physically hold onto. They said they were protecting the empire. They were, in truth, dividing the corpse. And then there was the matter of the actual corpse. Alexander's body became the most fought-over object in the ancient world. In Macedonian tradition, a king's burial decided legitimacy. Whoever buried him, ruled him. So, of course, everyone wanted it. It was supposed to be sent to Macedon. But Ptolemy, always practical, intercepted the funeral procession and diverted it to Egypt. There, he installed Alexander's golden sarcophagus in Alexandria, a glittering symbol of divine continuity, and an excellent tourist attraction. The other generals fumed. Wars broke out. Thousands died. Somewhere in all the chaos, Alexander's son, Alexander IV, was born, and within a few years, conveniently murdered, along with his mother Roxana. By then, no one was pretending to preserve the empire anymore. What's fascinating, and oddly haunting, is how quickly the myth began to outgrow the man. While his generals butchered each other, poets and chroniclers began weaving the first threads of legend. Alexander the Divine. Alexander the Dreamer. Alexander who tamed the impossible horse, crossed the ends of the earth, and wept because there were no worlds left to conquer. The same man who couldn't stop drinking and probably died of exhaustion was already halfway to Olympus. He became a figure who haunted other empires, Rome, Persia, even medieval Europe. Everyone wanted to claim a piece of him. Napoleon would later sleep with a copy of his biography under his pillow. Even the Mongols, centuries later, would tell stories about Iskandar the Two-Horned, conqueror of East and West. The name endured. The man, less so. The soldiers who had followed him, the hetairoi and the pages who survived, scattered. Some became mercenaries. Some governors. Some just ghosts in forgotten garrisons. The empire they'd built was never really meant to last. It was a comet, brilliant, brief, and unsustainable. But the world they left behind had changed forever. Greek language and art spread across Asia, mixing with Persian and Egyptian and Indian traditions to form something entirely new, what we now call the Hellenistic world. It was cosmopolitan, strange, and often beautiful, a world of cities where Greek statues stood beside Babylonian temples, and philosophers debated with Persian priests over imported wine. In its own way, that blending was Alexander's real empire, not one of territory, but of ideas. Still, there's something almost melancholy about it all. The young man who dreamed of uniting the world instead left it fractured beyond repair. His companions became rivals. His family line vanished within a decade. His name became legend, precisely because everything else had been lost. It's the oldest story in power. A man builds something too vast for anyone else to hold. Then he dies. And the people who loved him most are the first to tear it apart. History calls them the successors. They were, more accurately, the survivors. Let's drift, for a moment, to the quieter corners of that world. Imagine a Macedonian soldier, 10 years after Alexander's death. He's still in his armor, patched and dented, sitting by a river in Bactria or Babylon, staring at the water. He doesn't speak the local language. He doesn't know who rules the land now. All he knows is that once, he followed a man who made the earth feel endless, and now, even the sky seems small. That's the kind of silence history rarely records. The silence after the marching stops. The kind that seeps into the bones of those who outlived their purpose. And Alexander? Whatever remained of him, bone, ash, or symbol, eventually vanished too. His tomb, once the center of Alexandria, disappeared sometime around the 4th century CE. The location was lost. Maybe buried under sand. Maybe under someone's living room. Maybe nowhere at all. It's strangely fitting. The man who wanted to rule the world has no known resting place. He conquered everything but permanence. Still, his shadow lingers, in maps, in art, in the quiet admiration of generations who saw in him a reflection of their own impossible hunger. Every empire that rose after his, Rome, Byzantium, the Ottomans, carried a faint echo of his ambition. And yet, when you strip away the gold and glory, what's left is something almost fragile. A boy who tamed a horse. A son who wanted to outshine his father. A general who lost too many friends. And a man who never found a home big enough for his dreams. So, as we drift to the end of this long, drowsy journey, from the Mongol steppe to Macedon's marble, remember this. Empires rise like storms. They make noise, light, and wonder. And then they pass, leaving only the faint smell of rain. Alexander's men thought they were marching forever. Instead, they were writing an ending. One that the world keeps reading, again and again, in every new ambition that burns too bright. Sleep well, everyone. And if you dream tonight of endless plains, of riders, or of a man who thought he could outpace the gods, remember that even he, in the end, had to stop and rest. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're staying in the world Alexander left behind, but we're shifting the candlelight just a little. Away from the shining armor, the battle maps, and the endless talk of destiny. Toward the quiet figures who watched from the edges of his empire. The women. The wives. The ones history footnoted into silence. Because while Alexander was out conquering half the earth, there were queens and princesses, Persian, Bactrian, and Macedonian, trying to survive the kind of love that comes with an empire attached. So, get comfortable. Let's drift through their stories, the soft, sad, and strangely political corners of the world's greatest conquest. To begin, we should acknowledge something. Macedon wasn't exactly a feminist utopia. Women could be powerful, yes, but usually in the same way fire is powerful, fascinating, dangerous, and best handled with tongs. Still, in the royal court, women mattered, not as individuals, perhaps, but as symbols. Marriage wasn't romance, it was a treaty. Love was a kind of negotiation, and children were a form of insurance. And in that world, Alexander's mother, Olympias, reigned supreme. Olympias deserves her own bedtime story, though perhaps not a comforting one. She was an Epiro princess, clever, intense, and very much not someone to cross. Even in a court full of generals, she had a reputation for, well, let's say spiritual enthusiasm. She was a devotee of Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and generally unhinged behavior. Which meant that her religious ceremonies often involved snakes, torches, and late-night chanting, things that make for great mythology in Terrible Neighbors. She told her son that he was descended from Achilles. Later, she told him he was the son of Zeus himself. And Alexander, being a teenager with excellent cheekbones and too much ambition, believed her. Olympias never forgave Philip II for taking other wives. Nor did she forgive the court for underestimating her. After his assassination, which, to this day, has her fingerprints all over it, metaphorically if not literally, she ruled Macedon in Alexander's absence. And when he died, she briefly ruled again, cutting down his enemies with the same cool efficiency one might use to prune roses. If you picture her as the kind of woman who'd casually feed you figs while plotting your downfall, you're not far off. But let's move forward to Alexander himself and his peculiar approach to marriage. For most of his youth, he seemed allergic to the idea. He had close friendships, most famously with Hephaestion, his lifelong companion and general, but no known romantic attachments with women. That changed only when politics demanded it. In 327 BCE, while campaigning in Central Asia, Alexander met Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman described by ancient writers as the loveliest woman in Asia, which, given their tendency toward exaggeration, probably means she had both eyebrows and decent posture. The story goes that he fell for her at first sight. She danced at a banquet, a courtly, elegant performance with swords, and Alexander, ever the sentimental conqueror, decided to marry her on the spot. Was it love? Maybe. Or maybe it was another form of diplomacy, a gesture meant to unite his Macedonian men with their new Persian allies. Either way, the marriage surprised everyone. Roxana wasn't a princess of great political standing. She was local, foreign, and above all, she wasn't Macedonian. That alone made her dangerous. The court was full of ambitious men, and their equally ambitious wives, who saw Alexander's union with a barbarian as an insult. Roxana knew it too. And she learned quickly that survival required charm, patience, and, when necessary, elimination. When Alexander died, Roxana was pregnant. That should have made her untouchable. Instead, it made her a target. She gave birth to a son, Alexander IV, and for a brief moment, mother and child were the living embodiment of legitimacy. But legitimacy and longevity rarely coexist in Macedonian politics. Within a few years, Roxana had both her rivals, including one of Alexander's other wives, Statira, quietly removed. Removed, in this context, being the polite historical term for murdered discreetly and with great efficiency. Her story ends, like so many in that world, behind palace walls. When Cassander seized power in Macedon, he had her and her young son executed. A pragmatic decision. And a reminder that royal widows were more dangerous than royal armies. Then there were the other wives. Yes, plural. Alexander, for all his reluctance to marry, eventually made up for lost time. At the mass wedding of Susa in 324 BCE, he arranged for 80 of his officers to marry Persian noblewomen in a single ceremony, an act of cultural fusion so ambitious it made everyone deeply uncomfortable. He himself took 2 more brides that day, Statira, daughter of Darius III, and Persides, daughter of the previous Persian king. It was less a wedding than a political merger. A symbolic attempt to unite 2 worlds that didn't particularly want to be united. The Macedonians grumbled. The Persians smiled politely. And Alexander, sitting at the center of it all, probably convinced himself it meant something profound. But these women, Statira and Persides, barely appear in the record. Their lives were swallowed by the machinery of empire. They became symbols in a story written by men too busy recording battles to notice the women standing beside the throne. When Alexander died, they too became pawns. Roxana had Statira killed. Persides vanished from history, absorbed into the blur of forgotten queens. It's hard not to feel the chill of it. An empire that claimed to rule the world, yet couldn't find the space to remember its own women. And then there's Barsine, another quiet shadow in this tapestry. She was the widow of a Persian nobleman, and possibly Alexander's mistress long before Roxana appeared. Some accounts suggest she bore him a son, Heracles, whom later factions tried to use as a rival claimant to the throne. The boy, too, was eventually murdered, because of course he was. Barsine's story, like so many others, dissolves into rumor. She may have been the first woman Alexander truly loved, or simply another casualty of his restless ambition. Either way, she joins the long procession of women who orbit great men, shining briefly before fading into the dark margins of history. What's remarkable, though, is how power kept finding its way back to these women, even in death. Olympias' name endured. Roxana became legend. Even their enemies feared their ghosts. In a world ruled by kings, they understood the game better than anyone. They had no armies, no titles that lasted, and no guarantee of safety. But they knew how to wait, how to whisper, how to survive, at least for a time. History tends to flatten them, queens reduced to footnotes, wives turned into symbols. But if you look closely, you can still hear their voices, faint but insistent, beneath the noise of swords and speeches. They remind us that empires are not built by kings alone. They're built, and sometimes destroyed, by those who move unseen, the ones who pour the wine, soothe the tempers, and hide the letters that shouldn't exist. It's easy, now, to romanticize Alexander's world, to imagine marble halls and golden crowns, when in truth it was full of fear and calculation. To be royal in Macedon was to live in a constant state of beautiful peril. Especially if you were born on the wrong side of the throne. The women around Alexander understood that better than anyone. They lived in a world that worshipped heroes but survived through caution. Their triumphs were quiet. Their power, invisible. Their names, too often erased. And yet, their stories ripple beneath the surface, faint, persistent, inhuman. So tonight, as we let this tale drift towards silence, imagine them one more time. Olympias, walking barefoot through the torchlight, whispering to her snakes. Roxana, staring out over the Persian plains, one hand resting on her child's head. Barsine, waiting for letters that would never come. Statira, her wedding veil still scented with incense and fear. All of them pieces of a vanished empire, each one carrying the weight of a man's legend, and none of them allowed to outlive it. And that, in its quiet way, is the true ending of Alexander's story. Not the battles. Not the cities. Not the endless speeches about greatness. But the stillness that followed, the echo of women's footsteps fading down a marble corridor after the king had gone. Sleep well, everyone. And may your dreams be kind, especially to the ones history forgot. Hey everyone, You've made it. We've reached the quiet end of our long ride through history. The campfires have gone out, the horses are still, and the empire that once covered half the earth now exists only in stories and wind. If you've been drifting in and out of sleep through this, that's perfectly fine. That's kind of the point. The Mongols would have understood, actually. They believed that dreams and waking life weren't all that different. Both were journeys, both could take you far. And both, eventually, led you back home. So let's linger a moment here, at the edge of the steppe. The stars are enormous tonight. The air is cold and smells faintly of grass and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a lone horse nickers, the sound echoing softly through the dark. You can almost see them, the shadows of 1,000 riders, moving silently beneath the moonlight. Their banners ripple, their armor glints faintly, and for an instant, you could swear the empire never ended at all. It just changed shape. It became memory. The Mongols remind us of something very simple, and very old, that everything moves in cycles. The grass grows, the herds wander, the storm rises, and then the wind dies down again. Civilizations do the same. They burn bright for a while, loud, unstoppable, convinced of their own permanence, and then they fade quietly into the soil they once ruled. That isn't tragedy. It's nature. The Mongols didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they stopped moving. They settled. They traded the open sky for walls. And in doing so, they lost the thing that made them limitless. We all do that, in a way. We build, we conquer, we hold on tightly to what we've made, forgetting that everything we hold was once in motion. And maybe the Mongols' greatest lesson is this: that the world doesn't belong to the still. It belongs to those who keep riding. Somewhere out there, in the endless grasslands of Mongolia, the wind still sounds the same as it did 800 years ago. It rolls across the plains in long, low sighs, the kind that feel less like weather and more like memory. It's easy to imagine it carrying voices. Old ones. Names like Joki, Ogidi, Kublai. And at the center of them all, Genghis himself, a man who began with nothing but a horse, a dream, and an impossible amount of determination. It's strange, isn't it? To think that all of this, the walls of Beijing, the palaces of Samarkand, the roads that reached from the Black Sea to the Pacific, began with a boy alone on the steppe. No crown. No fortune. Just wind, hunger, and the refusal to give up. And somehow, from that, the world changed. So as we close tonight, take a deep breath. Feel the stillness around you. The world has quieted down again, just like the steppe after battle. The stars are patient. The grass is whispering. The wind is still carrying old stories, some in Mongol, some in silence. And maybe, if you listen closely enough, you'll hear them too. Not as echoes of violence or conquest, but as reminders of motion, of life moving forward endlessly. Because even when empires fall, the wind doesn't stop. It just keeps going. Like history. Like dreams. Like you, drifting now, softly, slowly, towards sleep. Soft music fades in low strings, wind sounds, distant hoofbeats. Good night, everyone. Thank you for riding along tonight. Until next time, rest easy and dream gently.